Hello, welcome to Architecture, Art and Society, a new series focusing on the period 1830 to 1930 when British society was transformed by industrialisation, urbanisation and unprecedented population growth. Birmingham's population was 10 times greater in 1930 than in 1830. Manchester and Leeds experienced similar expansion, and new urban centres emerged as a result of industrialisation. At the beginning of the 19th century, Middlesbrough was a hamlet of just 4 farmhouses. Architecturally, there were new buildings for the machine age, mills, factories, railway stations, as well as grand town halls and civic buildings, and the first large-scale church building programme since the Normans. At a time when there was a huge rise in non-conformism, whose adherents wanted to stamp their own distinct architectural identity on chapels. And many of the buildings of the period are still with us. They form an important legacy. The Institute of British Architects, later the Royal Institute, was formed in 1834. An architectural press began with The Builder in 1842. By 1900, there were half a dozen titles. The Builder, still with us, still being published today, was rebranded as Building in 1966. Artistically, our time frame embraces the Pre-Raphaelites, the arts and crafts movement, as well as Art Nouveau and Art Deco. In the world of scholarship, the term scientist was coined in the 1830s. Charles Darwin's groundbreaking work on the origin of species was published in 1859. Brunel's SS Great Britain, the first wrought iron screw propeller ship, was launched in 1843. By 1930, we'd entered the era of the great transatlantic liners. George Stephenson's rocket completed its trials at the end of 1829. The Liverpool to Manchester Railway opened the following year. The rocket marked the beginning of the age of the steam locomotive. It had a top speed of 30 miles an hour. On its test run in 1935, Sir Nigel Gresley's Mallard achieved 112 miles an hour and had more in reserve. Some towns grew as a result of the railway. Peterborough, Rugby, Doncaster, York, Carlisle, Crewe, Swindon all owe their development to the railway. Seaside resorts benefited. Skegness was laid out by the Great Northern Railway Company. Bournemouth became the largest non-industrial town in England. At the beginning of our period, there was little in the way of planning regulations. Towns grew, but there was overcrowding, poor sanitation and inadequate water supply, and socially a big divide between rich and poor. London, the first city in the modern world to have a population of 1 million, was rich in the west and poor in the east. This pattern was due to the prevailing winds, and it was repeated in urban centres elsewhere. With the cost of poor relief rocketing, an Act of 1834 introduced union workhouses. The 6 Tolpuddle martyrs were transported in 1834 for forming a prototype agricultural labourers' union. Working life in factories was geared to the needs of machines, with people, including children, working long hours in uncomfortable conditions. And even after the Reform Act of 1832, few people had the vote. There were genuine fears of civil unrest. Many saw education as the answer to social problems, but there was no compulsory education before 1870. Now, I mentioned a programme of church building. This was initiated by 2 Acts of Parliament passed in 1815 and 1818 that established a church building commission to provide grants for what became known as commissioners' churches. Sometimes the grant covered the full cost, often it was a contribution, requiring the balance to be raised locally. And the first of these to be built in the 1820s were neoclassical in architectural style, inspired by the buildings of ancient Greece and Rome. This is St James Church, Bermondsey, designed by James Savage. had seating for 2,000 and its bells were cast from cannon captured at the Battle of Waterloo. The portico has columns of the Ionic order, as does St Anne's Church, Wandsworth, another Commissioner's church, this time to a design by Robert Smirke. And Smirke was responsible for the Church of St George, Brandon Hill in Bristol. This time the portico has Doric columns. There were some early Commissioners' churches in medieval Gothic style, partly presaging changing tastes and fashion, but also because they were cheaper to build. It did away with the obligatory stone portico associated with neoclassicism, and designs became much more cost sensitive. Narrow towers and small chancels are typical, although some have since been extended. Thomas Rickman, a pioneer in the reintroduction of Gothic architecture, designed St Barnabas' Church, Erdington in Birmingham, in decorated Gothic style. St John the Evangelist Church in Derby by Francis Goodwin can seat 1,300. It's built on land donated by Francis Hurt from a family of industrialists who made a fortune locally from lead and iron. And this is perpendicular Gothic in style with cast iron window tracery, and a short narrow chancel was extended in 1871. From 1830, Gothic became the preferred architectural style for new churches, and even as new churches were being built, non-conformity was attracting thousands away from the Church of England. An ambitious programme of chapel building gained momentum in the second half of the 19th century. In non-conformist chapels, there was an emphasis on seeing the minister, on hearing the word. The pulpit or the rostrum was the focus, not an altar. Designs did away with processional aisles. This is Westminster Chapel, Buckingham Gate in London. It's by the architect W.F. Paulson. It was built in the 1860s, had seating for 2,500 people. And Paulson's use of cast iron in the roof removed the need for supporting columns and enabled all to have an uninterrupted view of the preacher. This is the United Reformed Church, Wellingborough in Northamptonshire, built as a congregational chapel in 1874 to a design by Caleb Archer and Edward Sharman. And as Gothic architecture increasingly predominated in the established church, non-conformists turned to classical models in order to set themselves apart. This is the Central Methodist Church, Saltergate in Chesterfield. It was built in 1870 with a pedimented portico, Ionic columns, a modillion cornice and dentilled eaves. And similar examples appeared across the country. I plan to unpack the themes I've outlined in this introduction as the series continues. And next time I'm going to take a look at how artists reflected and recorded the changes taking place around them and influenced thinking on the need for social reform. If you've enjoyed this video, hit the like and subscribe buttons and click on the notification bell to be informed when the next video is available. Or you can subscribe by clicking on the rose window over my shoulder.